Okay, get my head wrapped around what I'm doing right now. Yeah, last week we talked about living in the now, right? And how to stay in the now and all that wonderful stuff. And one of the synonymous words for now that I use interchangeably, interchangeable, yeah, whatever. I swap them around every once in a while, and that is Shabbat Shalom. And it actually is a term that is used a lot in the Jewish culture and communities. It's a greeting that is used on Friday nights to people as they enter into Shabbat. It's a blessing to have a restful rest. And there's some other things to it, but what really caught my interest was to dive into the living letters that make the words Shabbat Shalom. And I just did it on a whim. It's kind of interesting because I've been spending some time studying how to stay in the moment and all that stuff in Hebrews 4 and 2 Peter 1. So I thought, well, what is Shabbat Shalom really? And so I dug into, as I normally do with Hebrew words. I go right to the Hebrew letters and I look at what's there, see what letters are being used, and kind of get a little bit of an idea what's the story behind the word, right? And as you may know or may not know about me, I prefer to lean into the pictorial graphs of the Hebrew letters, the living letters, to find out what really is the root from these words, where do they come from, and the story. And each letter, as you know, has several meanings wrapped around it. It's a theme, but it has several different ways of viewing it or it being expressed in language. And when you line them up together, they create a sentence, and a whole sentence of Hebrew words will create a whole paragraph of story. So it's really, really cool, and it dives deeper. It's a story that's not even being expressed in the sentence that's being shared, and it gives a depth that is just enriches the scriptures and unlocks. And actually, what I've found is that it ties in many places where it doesn't seem in English, doesn't seem to tie together things. But when you dive into the language, into the pictorial or into the living letters and the story behind it, you see this subterranean connection that ties which seems to be two completely different scenarios or stories together. And sure enough, as I did this with Shabbat Shalom, I discovered that very thing. So I'm going to dive in a little bit to it. I'm going to get into the Hebrew a little bit and just start connecting the dots between some really interesting things that really have been things we've been talking about as a community in this past week or two. So just going into the word Shabbat Shalom. So Shabbat itself is basically made up of three letters, living letters, the Shin, the Bet, and the Tav. And then Shalom is made up of four, which is Shin, Lamed, Vav, and Mem. Okay, and the first place you see Shabbat is when Yahweh rests on the seventh day. In Genesis 2, verse 2 and 3, you see him talk about resting. And that's the English word that's put in there for Shabbat. The second, Shalom is first shows up in Genesis 15:15 when Yahweh makes covenant with Abraham. So I'm going to dive into this a little bit. It's very interesting. So the Shabbat itself, the English understanding is to cease. We often use the word rest, but it also really means it's the deceased or to cease from doing whatever you're doing. That's the root form of it. It's a stopping of something going on, complete stop, right? But if you look into, so with that understanding that in Genesis 2, Yahweh so he ceases from his work, right? And he stops creating in a sense, or he sets aside, he stops doing what he was doing, breathing creation, and now it's doing its own thing, right? So that's kind of the picture that we get as we read that passage, and I'll just read it here, just refresh everybody's memory. Verse 2, it says, and by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. And on that day, he Shabath from all his work. Verse 3, then God blessed the seventh day, sanctified it, because on that day he rested, Shabath, from all the work of creation that he had accomplished. So that's the first place that we find it. And so let's dig into the word Shabbat a little bit. Let's break down the living letters, the Shin, the Bet, and the Tav. In my studies and when I look at these letters, again, based on the pictographic or paleo pictures of the living letters, you've got Shin, which is actually a picture of teeth. The modern term is scripture, or modern script uses it and talks about it as being a flame. But the ancient picture is teeth, and two front teeth specifically. And two is kind of important, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Two front teeth, press, destroyed, separate, sharp, eat, two. Okay, so that's what's encapsulated in that picture of teeth or shin. Bet is a picture of, if you're looking down at a floor plan, it's the picture of a tent or a house. Okay, and basically it has this little shape with an opening to one room and then a internal doorway to another room. All right, which is typical of, thank you, Deanna. That's the shin, yep. And then the bet is typical of the nomadic tent that maybe Abraham would have, right? So that's where we get that floor plan idea of a bet, of tent, family, house, inn. Those are the words that you would use in that particular letter. And then in the Tav is just two sticks stuck together in a cross format. Doesn't even have to be a cross. We write it sometimes, but it's basically a cross of sticks, which symbolizes a mark, a signal, a sign, a monument, all right, or a covenant. So when we put that together, we use the Shin Bet Tav to create this story behind Shabbat. You get this idea that something is, that teeth or separates or pulls apart the structure of something, a house, a container, or it could be pulls apart to enter into a sign or wonder, and then it's a covenant, right? So when Shabbat, and as I was breaking this down, I was thinking about that Yahweh, when he spoke, he was causing a separation, right? He was separating dark from light. Everything about creation was taking from disorder or chaos, the koshek, pulling out a koshek and creating order. And actually, the Hebraic understanding is that he spoke, and it caused a void, in a sense, to happen in the koshek, that stretched it out, gave it space within which order was established. So there's a separating that's going on. And in it, he's building, so he's separating, there's the shin, and then the in, or the bet, is the container that he is doing it in, all right? And it's becoming a sign and a wonder of creation, right? Creation, all creation is a sign and a wonder, right? And there's covenant wrapped into that as you dig deeper and you see the nuances of what this is. So the Shabbat it's kind of an interesting thing. It's an action ceasing to do something, but it's also the rendering and establishing of something. So it's an accomplishment that's being stopped or finished, because that's really what Shabbat is capturing, this idea that something has accomplished, been finished, complete is another word for that, okay? So it's entering into the separation of something and resting in the covenant, or the sign and the wonder that's just been established. And that's kind of the idea of what Yahweh has done in Genesis 2, verse 2 and 3, is he's established, he's separated, he's given space to something that didn't exist before, established a house, he set the heavens and the earth in a house, right, within a space that he calls time and space. And he made it a sign, even in the smaller, so everything's a sign, but then he even talks about putting stars in the skies, the moon and, the two suns, right? The light, and the greater and lesser light became signs and became illuminations for a purpose. So this is all part of the Shabbat that he has established, and the rest is the exclamation point, or the ceasing of is an exclamation point. I'm entering into that. And it's interesting because that is what Israel is supposed to enter into when they rest. It isn't just to stop, right? A true rest, a heaven rest, isn't inactivity. It's a cease from turmoil, from toil, laboring under the sun, laboring in corruption. That's what the Shabbat is supposed to be for them, is to cease in their toil under the sun, to remember what they're supposed to be entering into, which is the Shabbat, which is the true rest, the complete rest that Yahweh had established for them. And it obviously didn't work out too well for them in remembering, because they struggled to keep the Sabbath as it was intended. So that's the idea of the Shabbat, okay? And then we look at the Shalom. The first time that Shalom shows up is in Genesis 15:15. And this is where Abraham is told by Yahweh to take a list. He's got a grocery list, in a sense, of animals that he has to basically sacrifice. And so Father gives him the list, and he goes and he sacrifices them, and it specifically says that he cleaves them in two, folds them in half, lays either side, folds them out, and lays them kind of flayed open, right? And then he falls into a great sleep, a deep sleep, as it says there, and there's fear and trembling, or a terror that comes upon him, and in this Yahweh begins to speak. Which is interesting, because the terror and the dread, as the English words are, is really much what it is. It's a very kind of scary environment that's been established as the sun is setting. The sun isn't set yet, it's on the way to set. And then he goes in that sleep, has his experience, and then he tells him what's going to happen to his seed. They're going to go into captivity, but I'm going to bring them out of it. He's setting all these promises. He's foretelling the history of Israel. And then he finishes up, says that, but you're gonna live for a long, long time, and you're gonna have shalom. Right. So this is the first place we see shalom, is where Yahweh promises him that he will live a ripe old age, a hoary age, which was an interesting word. It's kind of a strange word, hoary, just basically means gray or white. Due to age or with age, and that he would have shalom. And then he promises that he will bring them out of Egypt. And then here's the interesting thing, as we see that as soon as he says they'll come back out of Egypt, back into the land that he's at, he then steps through. So the sun is finally, it's like a pause in what Yahweh is saying, and it goes back to the setting, which is, now it's night, the sun is completely down, and now a smoking fire pot with flaming torch and smoke passes through this carcass, right? These carcasses, these flayed open, these divided carcasses. Think Shen when you think about divided, okay? And you see him seal the deal as he walks through it. And then he finishes up and promises and saying, this is the land I'll give to you. And he gives the boundaries for that land. Right. So what we have here is an establishment of a Shabbat happening, because he has in the Shabbat it's not spoken, but it's being implied, or it's being demonstrated in the establishing of a house, separating the cleaving of these animals to provide the shin of the sense, the separation part. You have the fire, the smoke. There's all these nuances of the Shabbat, the covenant, the house, establishing the house, the promises, and then the addition of Shalom. Now, Shalom is very interesting. This is when I first saw this, I leapt it within me because of the ramifications of the living letters in the word Shalom. So Shalom, as I said, it's 4 letters. It's the Shin, the Lamed, the Vav, and the Mem. And as we said, based on the pictures of the Hebrew letters, the ancient paleo, I always get these backwards, the pictographs of these letters, we have, again, the Shin, the 2 teeth, the teeth chewing, devouring, separating, okay? Then the Lamed is a symbol of the staff, shepherd's staff. And the words that often are tied to that picture is teaching, to or from, okay? Yoke, authority, and bind, like binding something in the sense of putting something under a bound. That ties into the teaching, bind these onto your forehead, right? Let them be a teaching. It's part of the authority of the word. So it has that idea of an authority teaching voice aspect to it, which is tied into the shepherd's rod, right? The Vav is a tent peg, or it can be meant as add or secure or hook, sometimes referred to as a nail, in the sense of a nomadic lifestyle. Again, thinking about Abraham as he's looking at this, it would make sense of a tent peg because of the tent, right? That he would be very familiar with tent pegs, and every so often having to pick up his tent and move it to another location, right? Very familiar of how to establish a tent with your tent pegs. There's a lot of great use and that word in scripture. So that's what the Vav is, the tent peg. And then finally a Mem, which is water. It can also be blood, chaos. It can also be mighty. Okay, so what these letters, and the beauty of these letters, as with most Hebrew words, you can take these living letters, and because of the difference of the meanings, there's themes, but there's nuances, it allows you to shape, you can write several different sentences based on these letters. But the one that really stood out to me was the idea of, again, the Shen, that's separating with through the power or the authority of the shepherd's rod, and securing, and that's the Vav, the waters. Okay, so he's using it's the idea, the Shin. You can even use the fire, the separating, right, by the power of the rod or the authority to establish or add or hook or to secure in place the waters. Okay, and so the waters can be not like, it's just not waters, right? But it can be blood, and it can be also chaos. We talk about the koshek. All right, so shalom in the Greek understanding, or the Greek word rene and the Hebrew word shalom, mean exactly the same thing, which is rest, but it's not just a rest, it's a completeness, it's a wholeness. It's been brought back to wholeness, brought back to perfect order. And so what you have is this idea that it's not, shalom is not just this easygoing, relaxed, take a deep breath and just rest there. Shalom is an actual aggressive action point, because what we're doing is we're using authority to bring order to water, to establish the boundaries of water or chaos. So when we say shalom, we're saying order to the chaos that surrounds you so that you can come into complete wholeness, come into order. So it's not just a rest thing. It's an aggressive, forceful act, declaration to bring order to chaos. Okay, that's kind of the overarching thing. So with Shabbat Shalom in mind, all right, there are several places, and I talked about there's that subterranean connection to different stories in the Bible that you wouldn't necessarily see on the surface if just reading English. But when you dive deep into it, you begin to see, oh, this is connected to that, and this is connected to that. So I use the example, first of all, I'll jump to the more recent one, and that is with Yeshua in the boat with the disciples in the midst of the storm. Okay, this is pretty wild here. So we know the story pretty well, right? It's in Mark 4, verse 39, and it says, "Then Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the sea. Silence, he commanded, be still, and the wind died down, and it was perfectly calm." Okay, and that's the Berean study or Standard Bible, anyways, that I pull from. What is interesting here is that you could pick out where the shalom is here. Now, everybody points to, he says, peace, be still. But it's really not peace, be still. That's not the Greek words he uses. He probably used Aramaic anyways, but the Greek translation isn't peace, be still. It's actually silence. Muzzle yourself. All right? And he's talking to two things. Most of us just think he's just talking to storm. He's not. He first addressed the wind. Then he addresses the water. All right. This wind and water thing is going to be interesting. You'll see it in a lot of places where it's actually two entities involved. It's not just the storms. All right. It's two things going on. So what we have here is the layout of the Shin, Lamed, Navav, and Mem being played out here in this passage. The Shin is obviously Yeshua. He is the fire. He's the one that separates. He's the one that separates us, right? Hebrews 4, going back to what we talked last week. He is the butcher knife that pierces and severs and fillets us wide open so that we can be clean, right? And it's the covenant that's built in him. So Shin is Yeshua. The Lamed is his voice, all right? And I will, it's interesting because when we get to another, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but and one of the other stories I'll connect to, the voice is also represented, or the rod is represented as a voice, is also represented as a hand, okay? In this case, the rod, the voice, is Yeshua's voice. That's the Lamed. So he's using the authority of his voice to speak to the wind and the sea, all right? So here's one that really blowed my mind here, and I'm going to dig into this more. But the next thing you see is he turns to the wind and he says, silence. But the Greek word has a positive term to it. It had a better way of saying it is he honored and corrected the wind. All right, it wasn't something of a monster or a beast, or something of chaotic nature that was evil. It was something that he was honoring. The word exhort or admonish is one of the words that translates in this Greek word. It's let's see if I can pull up. It's an interesting word. Where is it at? It's the word we use for rebuke. Or you'll see he rebuked the wind. It's actually epitimoio, which is actually, timoio is a word for fitting value or proper assigning of value to something. And epi gives it a intensifying effect. So he's saying, I honor you, wind. Now stop doing what you're doing. Okay. So that's what he's doing when he's rebuking the wind. Then he turns to the sea. Okay, so he turns and says silence. And this is where the muzzle work comes in. And what it basically is saying, shut yourself down. Stop. Right? And he muzzles the sea. There's your Vav, because, okay, Vav is the idea of securing. So he's securing it back to its place. Right? And then the mem is obviously the sea itself. So then you have shalom being played out. Yeshuva as the shin, the lamed of his voice, the vav, the securing the sea, and the mem being the sea itself. So shalom is being actively played out right here. And a couple of the interesting things is that the response of the wind is what's mentioned, nothing of the sea, by the way, right? The sea is sort of like it's the chaos, but the wind is what's causing the chaos. So he speaks the wind, and then the wind abates is the word, but it really means about it ceases and it grows weary. And then it says there was a perfect calm. The word for perfect in here is called mega, where we get our word, or megas, where we get our word mega, so great. Mega calm. Now, here's the interesting thing with the Greek word calm. And this is all tied into shalom, so this is why I'm going into it. The calm, its root word for calm is actually to laugh. All right, so I'm like, well, that's an interesting thing. So what you've got here is a storm. And the storm isn't just, this is a hurricane, guys. This isn't just like your typical winter storm or your typical, it's a little blustery out here. We've got some 3-foot wave caps coming into the boat. This is a massive hurricane storm. It's a violent torrent wind. It's raging, matter of fact, right? That's the wind. It's the raging hurricane winds are causing this storm. And so what happens is it goes from this raging, if you could personify the wind, right? He honors it, says to cease doing what it's doing, calm down. He's warning it before something bad happens. That's kind of what's encapsulated in that rebuke. He honors it, warns it, stop doing what it's doing, muzzles the sea, and then the winds respond and stop raging in anger and become calm to the point of almost laughter. I'm taking a little more creative license, but that the Greek word for calm, its root word is laughter, to laugh. And so you can kind of picture the wind changing its attitude, its heart or mind, from being angry and furious to being at rest and even to the point of joyful. Okay, so there's a shalom that shalom that he is operating in produces the shift in nature from being raging angry to being at rest and even joyful. And I was like almost like gurgling, kind of a giggle kind of sense that I was getting, almost like what you hear like in a creek or a little rivulet, just rocks giggling down off the river. I'm sorry, the water riveling, laughing on the brook, in a sense. Getting all my metaphors mixed, but you get the idea. Right? And that's that shift that shalom brings. But it's a very authoritative stance and attitude that he addresses to both the wind and the sea, and uniquely responds differently. So here's the thing is, he was in the Shabbat before he hit the shalom. Right? He was expressed that he entered in the Shabbat because we know that he was resting. He was ceasing from a day worth of teaching on faith, right? Because he was talking about the seeds. The mustard seed was the last parable he talked about before he jumped in the boat. He was actually in the boat when he was doing it. And then he hit across the sea. By the way, there were a lot of other people in that sea with him. It wasn't just, sometimes they just get so narrow focused that, it's just him and the disciples by themselves on this massive sea storm. There was everybody else, there were all the other boats that were traveling across with them. So there was a group of people that were experiencing this fear, this torrential storm that is going to kill them all. But just something kind of gives a bigger broad stroke of what's going on when he's saying shalom. So there's a lot of people watching this and saying, oh my gosh, something's shifted here. To the point where I'm sure it was more than just disciples said, who is this guy in the boat with us? I mean, even the wind and the sea, they listened to him. Anyways, that's the shalom that he's operating in. So the other story that ties in, and I'll bring it right kind of back to this idea is the parting of the Red Sea. right? Again, Shalom is there. And when Moses is told by Yahweh, okay, so to set the stage, we know they've come to the shoreline of the Red Sea. The Egyptian army is hard on their tail, and the Israelites begin to complain. They're really good at that. And they're saying, what'd you bring us to the Red Sea to kill us all? I mean, we could have done that in Israel or in Egypt. Why'd you do that? And so Yahweh turns to Moses and said, okay, tell the people, shut up. I'm paraphrasing, of course, and to keep moving forward. And I want you to take your rod and raise it up and then extend your hand out over the sea. That's all I asked them to do. And then divide it. And he said, then he said, divide it, divide the sea. All right. So that the Israelites can go across on dry land. That's the instructions. Raise your rod, put your hand over the sea, and divide it. Okay. So after he does this, after he's given the instructions, the pillar of fire and cloud go back behind the last Israelite and plants itself between Israel and Egypt, the army of Egypt. And right there we see the shin. Boom. The shin is connecting to Abraham again. Remember the covenant, the smoking pot and fire torch that went through. Now he's dividing chaos, which is Israel or Egypt, with his order, his promised people, Israel. And the shin is now standing between and is separating. Okay. So then you've got the shin, the lamed is Moses' rod, put it up, raise up the rod. And then here's the interesting thing, the hand overstretching the sea. Now it's not a vav, it's a yud in this case, yod for hand, which we get yod, which is looks like this in the pictorial, which is number 10 and is often translated as work, but it's also has a connection to the word, to the letter vav, right? And so instead of a voice, in this case, the rod is tied to the hand, which is also overshadowing sea. Instead of using his voice, he uses his hand. And then what else shows up? So Moses does this, and it says through the night, and all the other things is you see the story of Yeshua is also played in the nighttime. It starts off, they get in the boat, it's evening, and they start to cross over, and it's nighttime. So the night's important because it's tied into the storm, the chaos, and it's the revealing of the revelation that comes in the daytime. That's the other important thing, is the revelation that shines in the daytime. So Moses, at evening time, he does this, and then evening sets, and through the night it says that the winds, the ruach, blow across the sea from the east gate, okay, if it's coming out of the east, begins to separate out the water. This is the anchoring. He anchors or secures the water so that Israel can walk through on dry land. So now you see a vav being played out because he's anchored the water to where it should be, set the boundaries. And then the mem obviously is the water. And Israel the next day gets up and they head across on dry land. So we see here again, the playing out of Shalom is not a sense of just sitting and resting and doing nothing. We see an activation of Shalom with the Shin Lamed, the Vav, and the Mem being played out in this 24-hour period of Moses taking Israel across the sea. Again, pointing back to the Shabbat Shalom. This is the important part, is the covenant that Yahweh has given to the Israel that he started with Abraham, right? Because remember, this is the start of that covenant 400 years before, where he said, I'm going to do this, right? So the Shabbat is still in play right now with Israel crossing the Red Sea. And then Shalom comes into play, again, reinforcing the Shabbat. So it changes this concept of Shalom just being something we're looking to cease in the Shabbat and resting with peace, to a point of action, where Shalom now is we apprehend living or entering into the now. The Shabbat Shalom is that now where we enter in because of the covenant. And we have the authority in the Shabbat via Shalom, because we're at rest. Psalm 23, leads me by still waters, calms my soul. He says Shalom to the storm inside us in Psalm 23, so that we walk through the fear of the shadow of death, which you see with all the disciples in the boat. They are walking through the shadow valley of death in the fear that's tormenting. You see Israel fearing the Egyptians, the shadow of death that's chasing them down. You see Abraham, who has come under a terror of this being he doesn't know, but there's a terror and a fear and engaging. In that moment that there's the waters are spoken, or the waters is spoken, or that the sea is spoken at in us in its calmness, so that when we come into the Shalom, our waters have been calmed. And then we can speak and be Shalom and divide the waters. So Shalom is an action, an aggressive action that brings wholeness out to the order, completeness, so that when we truly cease, it is completion that we're actually living out of. And that encapsulates when I say Shabbat Shalom. I'm, again, Hebrews 4, stepping into it. And then I'm going to walk in the authority of the rod, the shepherd's staff, with my voice, with my hand, over the seas of my body, the seas of my soul, the seas of my world around me. And I'm going to say, shut your mouth to the seas. I'm setting your boundaries, thus far, no further. And I'm speaking to the wind, the breath, and saying, do no harm. Come into order what you're intended to do. I honor you for what you're supposed to do. And I release you into that. And I'm giving you fair warning to keep your boundaries, see? And this is the idea of Shabbat and Shabbat Shalom for our lives. And it starts inward, right? In Jerusalem first, then Judea, then Samaria, then out to the other edge of the world. So that's all that got unpacked in Shabbat Shalom for me this last week specifically. So there you have it.